Recording in progress. It sounds like crime in progress. So it's recording, and I'll post this. What we're going to cover today is absolutely, you're welcome, absolutely essential for understanding Aristotle's conception of happiness. Take attendance in just a second. But, we've said that human beings are social animals. We've said that they're rational animals or speaking animals and thinking animals. We've said that they're political animals, right? So we've already seen this in Sapiens. We've really seen it implicitly in Hobbes in the State of Nature. And we've also seen it in the Politics. It's a very simple argument. And the argument is this, that the types of relationships we have and what we do in them and why we do what we do are an outgrowth of our nature and what we're about as human beings, right? So in book one, Aristotle is concerned to hone in on what he thinks human nature is all about in very general terms. I mean, the very idea of human nature is a broad concept. In terms of the way in which human nature is distinct from other animals. And from there, he crafts a very specific conception of happiness that is then going to play out in our relationships. And whether we agree with Aristotle's conception of happiness or not, I think it's pretty obvious to all of us that somehow our relationships and our most important, our deepest, our most intimate relationships with other human beings are obviously going to be deeply intertwined with our own happiness, or we might even say our own conception of happiness. Aristotle, on one hand, is very aware that people disagree about what happiness is. And part of their disagreement about what happiness is has to do not with their general nature as a human being, but their more specific nature as an individual, right? So we already have this interesting complication. If we're going to say all of this is a product of human nature, well, there's a human nature that all human beings participate in to a greater or lesser extent, regardless of the time, regardless of the place, regardless of the specific moral codes or traditions or culture that you grew up in. And then, of course, there's elements of your nature which are unique and distinct to you that differentiate you from all other human beings. And those things that distinguish you, whether they're your nature or your nurture, say the neighborhood you were born in, the religion that was given to you by your parents or your society, or the laws that you're under. It means that everyone's going to have a slightly different opinion of what happiness is to them based on their own particular nature and their own upbringing, right? And so Aristotle is going to make an argument about human happiness that maybe we're not so thrilled about in our our democratic society. That is, if we think of the founding documents of our nation, that whatever people will say about the founding today, we still basically hold to this idea. The Declaration of Independence says everyone's created equal with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And you notice, for example, that, and of course, those very ideas, the right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, are understood to be a product of our human nature, either given to us by nature or nature's God, by nature or God, depending on who you are and how you think about that. But for us, since we're all equal, we don't recognize any one type of happiness as superior to another, because we recognize the right of everyone to pursue their happiness as they see fit, so long as they're not stepping on the toes of someone else and preventing someone else from achieving their own happiness. So Aristotle is going to be a little different. He's going to say there is one type of happiness, and it's the only thing that's really called happiness, right? Other things that other people might call happiness, he's going to say are not really true happiness. So he's going to make a judgment, or you might call it a value judgment, about not just people's right to pursue happiness, but the pursuit of a particular type of happiness, which for him is going to be the only real candidate for human happiness. And it's an interesting argument as to why. So let me take attendance and we'll jump into this. And as we go along, we can read and ask questions and so on. So attendance, I don't have too many people. 17 is not bad. And I'll just run through. I'm going to start with section A12. Is Maria here? No. Sarah? No. Ademola?
Good evening, Professor.
How you doing? Amanda? No. Jim is here, correct?
Hello.
How you doing?
Well enough. It's raining, so.
Oh, it's raining. Yeah, that kind of depressed me today. Some days when it rains, I'm like, I feel all warm and fuzzy inside because it's like, oh, I have no excuse to go outside now and I can stay cozy indoors. But today it was just a little depressing. So I'm feeling you there. Tashana is here. Yes.
Yes.
How you doing, Tashana?
I'm doing good. Thanks.
Kilkee Grant. I'm not even sure how to pronounce her name because I've never been here. Deja's not in the class anymore. Donald. Is Donald here? No. Diego. Oh, speak of the devil. Wow, what a fortuitous coincidence. Donald, can you hear me? Okay, I got Donald. Diego's not here. Itamar. Is Itamar here? No. And Jessica, I think, is here, correct?
Yes, I'm here, Professor.
There you are. How are you?
Okay, thank you.
And Michelle. No. And Catherine, not here. Musadatu is here. How are you, Musadatu?
I'm good, Professor. How are you?
Well, thank you. And Francesca, no. Jenny Santiago, no. Nick. Is Nick here? Doesn't look like it. And Petula, no. Eliester, no. Emmanuel, no. Brahima, is Brahima here? No. And Jeffrey, no. Okay. All right. On to A17.
Where'd he go?
Jessley, is Jessley here?
So tell me what happened. Did you finish everything?
No. Dalen is here, correct? How are you, Dalen?
Hi, Professor. How are you?
I'm great. No, is Norlin here? Doesn't look like it. Jonathan, I think that's a no. Salimata, no. Humayan? I don't think Humayan's here.
No, I'm here.
Oh, you're here. Great. How you doing?
No,
I'm here too.
Yeah, Donald, I got you. I got you just as you came in. Thank you. And Tatiana? No. Carrie's here. How you doing, Carrie?
I'm good, Professor. Thanks,
Great.
class.
And Sophia.
Hello,
is
Professor.
here.
How are you?
How you doing?
I'm good, thank you.
Great. Thank you for asking. Beth Zali, I don't think is here. Jason? No. Fatumata. Yes. How are you, Fatumata?
Hi, I'm here.
And
Thank you.
Madeline is here. How are you?
Hi, Professor. I'm well. Thank you. How are you?
Great. Nadira is not here. Chervelle is not here.
Hi, Professor. I'm here.
I'm sorry. Did I go over somebody?
Nadira is here.
Nadira, great. Got it. And Omar is here. Joel is here. And Cynthia is here. And Franklin is here, correct? Yes. And Mario is not here. And Natalie is not here. Anybody I left out? Okay, I think that's it. All righty. All right. So there's I don't know, 3.5 or 4 things I want to touch on with this text tonight that will situate you mentally. What the key to this text is to having a little understanding of the framework of its structure, because he seems to introduce topics in a rather haphazard way, right? So that's one thing, the framework of the structure of the text. The other thing is we're going to talk a little bit about just the framework of the way Aristotle thinks about these issues in this text. He has a kind of pre-packaged set of ideas that we've actually already seen in the politics. We haven't talked about them in person, but this kind of structure of ideas is going to play out in this text. And once you kind of see how he thinks about things, while you may not ever understand every passage of the text, you're going to start to understand, at least you have a general idea and understand why he's saying what he's saying. So I want to speak about the organization of the text. I want to speak about just the opening lines of the text, which seem to have nothing to do with the text. It's so weird where he starts this text. Does everyone agree? Like, he does not start with a nice, satisfying introduction that lets you know the roadmap to what's going to unfold in this text. He starts out kind of in his place that leaves you totally stranded mentally. Like, why is he talking about this, Professor? I have no clue, right? So if you felt that way, don't be surprised. And it all starts with his opening lines where he says a lot without you realizing fully what he's saying. Then we'll get on to this issue of human nature, what he means by it. It's not too complicated, really. And then the issue of human happiness, which again is actually going to turn out not to be as complicated as you might think. So if you want to get an understanding of what this text is, you start with the title, right? The title is the Nicomachean Ethics, right? And the key word here for our purposes is ethics. It's a book of ethics, right? The politics dealt with political community. What happens in the political community? That's the main business of the polis. It's politics. It's all the business of the polis, right? And the polis, when we're looking at politics, we're dealing from the level of the collective. We're dealing from the level of the group. We're seeing human beings in terms of their group, you could say their group dynamics as a whole community. And we're not really differentiating individuals. And we're looking at the way the political structure, say it's democracy or aristocracy or monarchy or republic or some other form of regime of government, how that influences the whole community and the types of laws they make. And of course, when you make a law, you don't affect one person, you affect a whole community. And if, you know, following some of the things that I posted in the videos, in the PowerPoints, and in the study guide, you know, politics by definition is something that affects everybody. That's why it's a political issue rather than, say, a private issue. You think political issues are public issues. They're issues that impact the public generally rather than just the fate of one or a few people or just a segment of the whole society, right? So one way to think about what politics really is, and it's kind of unusual, politics is really the science of the happiness of a political community. Politics is not just understanding about how community works. And then second, it is literally the kind of thing you practice to try to bring about the well-being of your community, right? The common good, right? You try to pass laws in a political community in order to benefit the public interest or the common good or the good of all, however you want to think about it, right? So politics is actually the science of the happiness of the polis, right? We want the whole community to be happy, and we're not focusing on any individual person. Ethics is also the science of human happiness, but instead of seeing this science from the point of view of the whole community, it's now, and the life of the whole community. Remember, what is the polis? It comes into existence for the sake of living, but it remains in existence for the sake of living well. And therefore, political science is about crafting society so it can achieve happiness, so it can live well. So ethics, in a sense, is the same thing. It's the science of human happiness. And of course, you notice a problem there. You say the science of human happiness. This clearly isn't a science like physics. It's not a discipline like mathematics. It's a messy science, because how do you prove what it's hard enough to achieve happiness? How do you even figure out what it is, given that everybody has different opinions? So, for example, in chapter 5 of book 1, he talks about 3 different lives that the community holds up as being happiness, right? And so we see that there's disagreement about what happiness actually is, because happiness is something that's hard to prove. Like if you had to define and say, this is the truth of what happiness is. And why is it hard to prove? People have different opinions and they disagree with one another. But in particular, ethics is the science of the happiness of the individual rather than the group, or rather than the collective, or rather than the polis. So in this text, we're going to see the issue of human happiness viewed from the kind of individual perspective, in terms of your life, so to speak, and in terms of achieving this thing he calls happiness, not from the point of view of the group, but from the point of view of the individual, and the kind of life he thinks that human beings should live in order to be happy. And then, of course, we're going to see in books 8 and 9 the role played by friends or friendship in contributing or making possible our own happiness, and what exactly that role is. So ethics, I'm just kind of giving you a couple different ideas here. That ultimately, the ethics comes from a Greek word, ethikos or ethos. It's a branch of moral philosophy, typically part of political science, and it's dedicated to a description of good character and how it contributes to human happiness. Ethikos, it just means having to do with morals, morality, or an individual's character. And when we think about a person's character, we think about all their nature, which is to say they were born with certain dispositions and certain tendencies of their nature psychologically. And their character isn't just their raw nature, but their character is shaped in a kind of dialogue or a combination between their natural tendencies, the way they were born, right? What does Lady Gaga say? I was just born that way, right? And there are certain things that you're just born with, right? Many people will say that our identities are wholly shaped by our environment, right? And that we don't really have a fixed nature. Well, I don't know. Most parents I've heard, when they have like 3 kids and they see how they all came out differently, despite the fact that they live in the same household with the same parents, with the same rules, you can see their nature being expressed, because they don't all end up the same. And parents see things in infant children and babies that when they grow up, they still see those same tendencies, despite all the education, habituation, training that they've had. But character is a product of nature and nurture, right? And our character, our moral character, is shaped by all the rules that we're obliged to follow. And you could say all the education experience that we have in training us to do what is considered in our society the right thing, right? So you'd call it socialization or habituation, right? Everyone, when they're born into a society, is forced to comply with a whole set of rules coming from their parents. And rules are instilled in people through training, Aristotle says, not through book education, at least not at first, certainly not at first. Most of the training of one's character comes through kind of hands-on conduct, right? And what if, for example, let me ask this. What do parents use to get their children to do the right thing? What are the 2 things they use to guide their child's conduct?
Punishment?
Yeah, punishment And not, I hope not just punishment. What else?
Reward.
A
Yes.
treat. A treat.
It's that simple. And of course we saw this in Hobbes, right? He was trying to set up a system really of rewards and punishments that would allow people to give up this freedom in the state of nature and give up a whole bunch of freedoms, but then get, law and order that would allow them to live peacefully. And he had to come up with a motivation or he had to come up with a structure of society that would encourage people to accept that the best way to get rewards was actually to follow the rules rather than trying to break them and get away with them. And of course, this was a big theme of the Plato's Republic, right? Every character, it seems, except for Socrates in Plato's Republic, seems to think that the best thing to do is whatever one pleases, including breaking the rules. And the key is you just need to be able to get away with it, right? Okay, so shaping one's character is all done through various rewards and punishments based on some code of rules, some code of morality, right? So the Greek word ethos, I don't know, you go to Starbucks and there's water called Ethos, and I guess it's very pure or something, and it makes you have good character. The word ethos in Greek can refer to two things, and they're interrelated. One is custom or habit. And a custom or a habit is just a behavioral practice that helps to train people, and it relies on reward and punishment to get them to do the right thing, right? And as their as the kind of strictures of habit are imposed on them, they start to internalize them, and they start to do, for not completely, but for the most part, they'll do what they've been trained to do within reason, depending on how good the rules are and how good the training is. So habit is part of the process of character formation. It gives you good character, right? And Aristotle's argument is that there's two parts to our nature. There's a biological nature that's given to us kind of raw, like an animal nature. But then we also have a more refined, what you would call a second nature, right? And second nature is the result of training, right? The more you get habituated to doing something, you start doing it automatically, right? I mean, so for example, I don't know, Tom Brady can throw a football, with defenders in his face and all kinds of things. And you say, oh my God, how does he do that? He's so talented. Well, he's thrown tens of thousands of footballs in his adult life. So he's habituated himself to be able to throw the ball when he's got a 6'7", 350-pound guy in his face. So it doesn't just magically happen. And then ethos also means character, right? Having to do with our moral nature. And one's character is a product of our nature, but it's also a product of nurture in some type of mixture with one another. What is this book, the Nicomachean Ethics? You'd call it Ethike Episteme, right? Fancy Greek. What does it mean? It just means the science of ethics, right? And the science of ethics tries to not just understand how a human being should live in light of what they are, but also to give us the tools to practice it. So there's something really interesting about this book, is that when you read it, it's not just like philosophy, it's practical. You might even call it a self-help book, right? And I think one thing that's very powerful about this text is its way to give us really fundamental insights into the basic features of our lives, especially in terms of thinking about our lives in a bigger picture than we might normally, and for the purpose of making our lives better, right? And what are the two big problems of achieving happiness, right? What are the two big problems? Number one is when we know what the right thing to do is, but it's hard to do it, right? Because we have a lot of competing desires in us, and we don't always want to do the right thing. There are other things we want to do for all kinds of different reasons. And one of the problems of achieving happiness is human beings have a lot of different motivations inside of them. and they're competing motivations. And very often they pull you in different, even opposite directions. They conflict with one another. They contradict one another. And therefore, if you've ever experienced that situation where you've encountered, on one hand, I want to do this, on another hand, I want to do this, and those two things are fundamentally in conflict, and they both seem kind of like maybe not the right thing to do, but the thing you want to do, you can see some of the problems. So when we know what the right thing to do, sometimes it's hard to do the right thing. Then the other problem, and you could call that willpower, or you could call that the problem of self-restraint, right? The other problem is just the problem of ignorance, which is we want to do the right thing, but we don't really know what the right thing is to do, right? Where we're just not clear on it. There are numerous instances in life where when you have rules, they're general, and very often most situations conform to the rules. I should do this and I should not do that. But then at some point you discover there are situations that don't seem to have a clear rule established for them. And the question is, what do you do? Right? And that becomes a much more murky situation. Okay, so ethics, the science of human happiness. Let me ask a stupid question. Why do we as human beings care about the science of human happiness? Why do we care?
Can you repeat that, Professor?
Why do we care about the science of human happiness? Why do we care about ethics, which is the science of human happiness? Why do we care?
I think that's what we want. That's what we really want. That's our goal.
We want what?
Happiness, to find pleasure, happiness.
Okay, because we want to be happy, right? So one of Aristotle's basic premises is that every human being desires to be happy, right? And that in a sense, and on one hand, it's really obvious, right? But he gets us to think about our situation as individuals in the stage of our life in a very kind of broad and comprehensive way. Why does ethics matter? Because it's the science of human happiness and we all want to be happy. Therefore, it's immediately relevant to our most basic, our most fundamental, but also our most intimate needs and desires for life, right? And the one thing he's going to help us see from the point of view of this book being like a self-help book is that he really sees how every facet of our life and our needs and our desires are all interconnected, right? I think, how should I put it? There's a certain stage, maybe I'm just speaking from my own personal experience, because where else can you speak from? But I think there's a stage in everybody's life where you think you can kind of do this over here in one facet of your life and do this over here in another facet of your life and do this over here in the third facet of your life. And you don't really recognize how, say, let's just simplify. The bad thing you're doing over here, whether you realize it or not, is impacting things over here and is impacting things over here because it's all interconnected, right? You can't, while we live as adults, we have to like compartmentalize. We have to put certain aspects of our life in boxes and kind of contain them. What he recognizes is that all those containers that are compartmentalized, like this part of my life over here, I don't know, the love life, the health aspect, the work aspect, the school aspect, the relationship aspect, all those things impinge on one another. And of course, ultimately, they all impinge on one's happiness. So you can't have some of it working. You have to have it all kind of coordinated as like a machine where all the cylinders are kind of firing in harmony with one another. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is just touch on this outline, because in looking at the plan of the text, it really reveals some things about what he's actually saying and what his argument actually is, right? He's not just explaining things, he's making a claim, he's making a hypothesis or a thesis or a kind of argument about what he thinks is correct here, right? We may not agree with it. So if this book deals with the science of happiness, and that's what ethics is, then it's only natural that he begins the text by talking about the highest human good or happiness, right? So let's make our first funky little acknowledgement about Aristotle. When he talks about happiness, he uses many different expressions for it to capture different aspects of it. So when he talks about the highest, what does he mean by the highest human good? Any thoughts? What is he talking about? Let's ask this. What is the highest human good?
Could that be like similar to self-sufficiency or no?
It's connected to it. He says the highest human good or happiness. What's the highest human good?
Like on a hierarchy or?
Pleasure.
Okay, so first you realize that that life consists of a hierarchy of different types of goods, right? And we'll come back to this word good in a second. Let's put it this way. A good is a generic term for a thing that you're trying to achieve or a thing that you want. And it's a good. It could be a physical good, like, we talk about commercial or consumer goods, like products, stuff, wealth, right? But a good is not just a physical thing like you'd find at a store. A good is anything that you think you want. And why do you want it? Because you think it's good for you. Otherwise, you wouldn't want it, right? Or you think that there's some good to be had from doing it. So what's interesting about Aristotle's usage here, it's not necessarily a strictly moral usage exactly. For example, Aristotle makes a claim in the book that everyone, when we perform an action, whatever it is, that they do it under the premise that they think there's some good in it. They might not think it's the best thing to do, but they think there's some good to be had from it. So for example, that would mean that when people rob a bank, they think there's some good in the broadest sense of the term good. It might not be the just thing to do, might not be the right thing to do, but they think there's some pleasure that's going to be attained. I don't know, they might get a lot of money. It sounds good to me. I just don't want to have to rob a bank for it. So a good is anything that someone thinks is going to benefit them, right? Think about this. These kind of edgy things. Why do people do heroin, right? Heroin, that stuff will kill you, right? So what the heck would motivate someone to take such a risk to do it? Well, the tricky truth about heroin, which is precisely why people get killed from it, is because there's obviously some pleasure attained in doing it, or they wouldn't do it in the first place. If it were just simply bad, in terms of it didn't produce any pleasure or any benefit of any kind, right? Nobody would do it, right? The challenge with heroin is there is a pleasure to be gained from it, but there's also perhaps a much bigger downside to it, right? And so a good is just something you desire. The highest human good for human beings is what? What's the highest thing we desire?
Live well.
Happiness.
Yeah, and living well is just a synonym for what?
Wealth.
Living well is just a synonym for what?
Survival.
Oh, no. We want more than survival. We don't want the politics spells it out. we don't want mere life. We want to live well. And then the question is, what does living well mean? What is a synonym for living well?
Luxury.
So that's a specific example. What's a synonym for living well? It starts with an H.
Happiness.
It's happy.
Some people have said it, but other people aren't getting it. Happiness.
Happy.
Happy.
Happiness. I said it.
Why
Happiness.
I didn't say it is because it was just too simple. Like it has to be
Okay,
something more
good.
than happiness.
Well,
That's why.
well, when we're dealing with Aristotle, we got to deal with those simple building blocks, because once we get those in place, we're going to start going to more complicated places. So happiness is just another way of saying the highest human good. And by him saying that there's a highest human good, he's acknowledging that life consists of, number one, a large variety of different types of goods. And different people want different things. There are a core of goods that we all need and want, basic necessities of life, right? And not only are there a variety of goods, but there's a hierarchy. And at the top sits happiness, right? So that's key. So let's go back to, so this outline, just to be clear, if we go here, you see that the ethics consists of 10 books, and we're focusing on book 1 tonight. And you'll notice that this has numbers 1 through 10, but you'll notice that this is not in perfect alignment with the books. This does not mean book 1 or book 2, book 3. You'll see that the books are listed here, and the books are done. So you have the notation for book is, it's book 1, chapter 1 to chapter 12, to book 1, chapter 12. And then this is book 1, chapter 13 to book 3, chapter 5, and so on and so forth. So this is an outline actually created by the translator and editor of the text, not by Aristotle itself. So it starts out, what is happiness? That's the focus of most of book 1. What is happiness? And Aristotle provides an answer to that question. Off the top of your head, what would you say Aristotle's definition of happiness is? Anyone? Carrie, what is Aristotle's definition of happiness? What do you think Aristotle's definition of happiness is? We all want to be happy, but we don't know what Aristotle's definition is. How are we possibly going to be happy ourselves? Once we know what it is, we'll go and try to achieve it.
Aristotle's happiness is just living a life of goodness. Basically, doing what
let's
you
stop
think
there.
is right.
So you said Aristotle's concept of happiness is living a life of goodness. I agree. That's not how he would say it, or I don't think that's exactly how he would say it, but we're definitely in the right direction. And what did you add after that, Carrie?
That was all I said, Professor. I'm sorry.
Pardon?
Could it mean the 3 kinds of goods, ends and means and ends?
We'll get to that.
Okay.
Happiness is going to be an end of our lives. The goal, to say it's an end, is to say, it's very simple. An end is a goal. It's what you want.
So it's end or good?
And an end is a good, right? Because what you want is going to be a good, because by definition, it's something that you're pursuing. And if you're pursuing, you think it's good, and therefore it's a good. What is Aristotle's definition of happiness? Okay. All right. Well, let me give you a hint. It has to do with living a virtuous life. Does that ring a bell? Living a life of virtue of some kind or another? Anyone?
Professor, with the word virtue, are you referring to like abilities to do things that are positive?
Well, this raises the question of what is meant by virtue. What are we talking about here when we're talking about virtue?
Just well-meaning, kind.
Intention.
Okay,
Good,
good.
bad.
So this is a tricky word, and you're all getting to the right point. So in our society, when we use the word virtue, we mean one element of a bigger picture of what Aristotle means by it. When we say the word virtue or that someone's been virtuous, we mean what he would call moral virtue. And moral virtue has to do with the ability to do the right thing and the action of actually doing it, right? One of the important things we're going to discover for Aristotle is like stupid is as stupid does, meaning a virtuous human being is not just someone who calls themselves a good guy or a good girl. It's someone who actually demonstrates their decency or their goodness through their actions, right? So what they are and what they do are synonymous with one another. And that's also going to have a big impact on happiness, because happiness isn't going to be something you feel. It's not going to be simply a state of contentment. It's going to be a way you live your life, which is a little bit different. And I think he acknowledges that when you live your life the way he thinks you should, that it's going to be satisfying, that it's going to be pleasurable, but he doesn't associate happiness directly with the pleasure that comes from living this way, but rather the act of living a certain way, right? It's very different. Since I would say the 19th century, thinkers about happiness, and it's filtered into society. It's obvious we associate happiness with pleasure and a feeling of contentment, right? And this is interesting because Aristotle definitely does not. He certainly acknowledges that pleasure is going to be part of it, but he doesn't believe that that's the central element of how he defines it. Okay, so virtue. Virtue is a Latin translation of a Greek word, and virtue literally means excellence. Excellence, right? So you could say of someone, you have many different virtues. And what you're really saying is you have many different excellences. You have many different faculties or attributes about you that are kind of superior or above average or exceptional or what have you, right? So virtue literally means excellence. Moral virtue would then be that virtue pertaining to your actions toward other people and acting correctly and acting in a righteous manner, in a just manner, and so on and so forth. Does Aristotle talk about any other types of virtue beside moral virtue? Okay, so let's step back a second. If we look at this structure here, you actually see a kind of argument being made. His first question in this ethics, which is about the science of happiness, is a basic question you'd think he'd start with. Well, what the heck is happiness, right? His answer to the question of what happiness is, to put it in the most general terms, is a life lived virtuously. A life lived virtuously. And then, of course, the question comes up, well, what the heck is virtue? And what does he mean by virtue? If you're talking about living an excellent life, well, you have to be a little more clear about what you mean by that. It's just like saying, the goal of everybody's life is happiness. Well, duh, we all know that. The question is, what specifically do you mean when you characterize something as happiness? What are the details, right? So once he's said that happiness is living virtuously, right? Then he goes on to talk about what? You see number 2 in the outline. He goes on to talk about virtue in general. What is it? And then more particularly, moral virtue. And then he goes on to talk about things dealing with how we go about acting, as in making decisions to act in life. Because if you think about what moral virtue is, it's inevitably taking an action relative to someone else or yourself, right? So moral virtue has to do with your actions toward others and acting correctly rather than incorrectly, or doing good rather than evil, right? So then the moral virtues, he goes on to list in books 3 through 5 what he sees as all the moral virtues, right? So he's got courage, moderation, liberality, magnificence, greatness of soul, ambition, gentleness, friendliness, which is not the same as friendship. Friendliness is a virtue. Truthfulness, wittiness, and justice, right? So what is he saying here? Or what might he be saying? If you demonstrate these virtues, these moral virtues, it's going to lead to your own happiness. Does that make sense? Does that sound plausible?
Yes, to me it does.
Okay, good. All right.
Yes.
So then but we discover
Yes.
that there aren't just moral virtues, there are also intellectual virtues. And what does he mean by that? We have excellences in how we interact with others and how we conduct ourselves. There's a right way and a wrong way, and excellent people carry themselves in the right way. And the right way for Aristotle is defined by meeting the demands of these specific virtues. And in this section, he really goes on to define them in detail. And actually, this is going to be the one chunk of the book that we're not really going to focus on because it doesn't have a direct enough bearing. We'd be stuck on the ethics forever if we got too deep in it. But we also have intellectual virtues. And by intellectual virtues, he means you could talk about it as like mental aptitudes, learning aptitudes. For example, those people who are good at math, those people who are good at chess, those people that are good at making prudent decisions in their life, those people with good memory, right? So he talks about the things of the mind, right? And the various capacities and intellectual virtues are the product of our use of reason applied to our understanding of the world, right? So intellectual virtues are the result of our use of reason applied to trying to understand the world around us. So
Could it mean,
pardon?
could it mean like not taking something for face value, but going beyond that?
Certainly, right?
Okay.
So part of the problem of life is we think we know what we should do. We think we know what will give us happiness, but that's an opinion we have. And in the trial and error of experience, we might discover that we actually weren't right about it, right? So part of the problem of happiness and morality in general is I talked about those situations where people don't always know what the right thing to do is, not because they don't want to do the right thing, but they're not sure, because rules never cover all circumstances. And those are the great challenges. For example, a circumstance where instead of one principle on which you should act, like I should do this and not that, it turns out that there are two principles in play in one situation, right? I don't know. Imagine you've got two friends and something happens. And if you do one thing, you'll satisfy one friend. And if you do the other thing, you'll satisfy the other. So how do you negotiate dealing with both of them? And it might not be people, it might just be principles, right? For example, you could have a basic principle as a morally virtuous person, I shouldn't lie. But then what happens when you encounter that situation where you discover actually it might actually be appropriate to lie because the consequences of telling the truth are actually much worse than lying. Like there's a famous example by Kant of imagine a murderer comes to your door, because he had this thing against lying, and in all circumstances, the Greeks are a little more flexible with lying. If you read Homer, you see that. But Kant really wanted everybody to be kind of rigidly truthful, it seems. And, imagine you had a murderer come to your door, and you knew they were a murderer and they had a knife in their hand and they were looking for your neighbor. Would you tell them the truth? And of course, I think the obvious answer is you'd lie to them, right? Pretty simple. In the same way, for example, like in the Republic, when the madman who's given you his weapon, he wants his weapon back, but he's mad. The obvious solution is there's a principle of returning people's property because it's theirs, but there's a higher principle of not giving the crazy guy the gun because he'll go and shoot someone, right? As we've seen in the news just recently. Okay, so interesting thing. In both cases, reason is an important part of human beings achieving virtue. And we should just mention this right now. For Aristotle, the defining feature of human nature is that we have reason. We have the ability to think and to speak. And therefore, he's going to view almost everything in our lives through the lens of our capacity to reason, right? So moral virtue involves using your reason in terms of how you act toward others in the practical realm. How you act. Practical things have to do with actions, has to do with living life in the world with people. Intellectual virtues has to do with the use of reason simply for the sake of understanding rather than for the sake of action. Of course, you discover the more you learn in the abstract, right, the more that might actually contribute to you figuring out what are the right things to do in life. Yeah. So,
Professor,
yes.
I'm actually kind of like talking about this in my social work class, and can I like ask you a question? So like,
Yes.
let's say if I were to be a social worker and I was working with a client and I had my own values, but I have to respect the client's values, and like it's basically like a code of ethics where you have to be aware of like you kind of have to how do you say it, like reflect on your values and all of that. But when you're working with a client, like you said, kind of like you're living in a world where you have to know like other people's happiness, I guess. Like, could that be an example or no?
Okay, sure. And so actually, that's how we understand. So Aristotle has, let me just say this, and then I'll come back to your point. Aristotle has a broader understanding of what ethics is. So today, when we use the word ethics, we normally attach it to a specific profession where ethics means spelling out the code of conduct within that profession. So there's like an ethics of being a doctor, like the Hippocratic Oath. There's the ethics of being a teacher. There's the ethics of being whatever it is that particular discipline or that particular profession has its own specific rules that one is obliged to follow in order to practice it, whatever it is in an ethical way. Right. I mean, for example, if you're a doctor or if you're a research scientist, you don't do studies on human beings without their consent and things like that. That would be unethical. So in your situation, the question is what exactly? Just
So like, how would that?
You're talking about a dilemma between your own, you could say your own values and the values of the person you're working with?
I mean, kind of like I wanted to see if that would fit into like the difference between moral and intellectual virtues or no.
No, I would say that's all moral virtue. Remember this word virtue for the Greeks, for the Romans, and really in the strictest sense, it just means excellence. So actually, when we're talking about intellectual virtue, we're setting aside all this issue of correct conduct and appropriate behavior and righteous behavior. And we're talking about the powers of the mind. We're talking about the abilities of the mind. We're talking about intellectual virtues are a combination of raw intelligence coupled with study, right? And of course, he's going to talk about, we have like human beings have multiple intelligences. That's how we would describe it, multiple intelligences. So human beings, for Aristotle, have multiple intellectual virtues. There are different powers that the mind has to be able to do different types of things, to understand different types of things, and it requires different types of cognition or different types of understanding to do it. Does that make sense?
Honestly, I'm still a little lost. Can you just like kind of repeat what moral virtue is? Maybe that's the one I'm not understanding.
Okay. Yeah. Moral. So for virtue is excellence. You do something in a superior way, or you show a certain type of superiority, right? So moral virtue is superior conduct. You act in a way that's appropriate. You act in the right way. And specifically, typically you do things that are hard to do, right? That are known to be right, but are not easy to do. Like, for example, exhibiting courage. Everybody knows that that's an admirable trait, right? And we're not talking about recklessness, and we're not necessarily talking about courage on a battlefield, although we could be. But the challenge with courage is it's not easy for people to have, right? Because courage requires, well, courage, and a lot of people are not willing to. They're cowards. All the time we fail to live up to our own expectations of what we hope to do ourselves. We don't meet our own expectations. So moral virtues just have to do with excellences of human conduct, right? And we can just look at the examples here, right? So moral virtue is courage, the ability to stand up in the face of your own fear of failure, or if you're on the battlefield, the fear of death, in order to do something that you know is right, right? They were just talking about a politician the other day who had a lot of competing interests, and she just vetoed a bill that they're accusing her of not having the courage of signing the bill because she got pressure from various interest groups, right? So when the chips were down, when things really mattered, after creating this great image of being a kind of righteous politician, the argument is she kind of chickened out and stuck her finger in the air and went with the flow instead of doing what she knew was right. Moral virtue, right? I mean, how do we talk about people who are righteous, right? People who have moral virtue are righteous, and this list just is a list of what Aristotle sees as basically the essential or the central moral virtues. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
The key thing is moral virtue has to do with our actions. It's the way we carry ourselves with other people. Intellectual virtue just has to do with our thinking, right? And our thinking skills and the different types of intelligences we have as human beings, whether it's, I don't know, reading comprehension or mathematics or geometry or memory or abstract thinking, things of that sort. And these intellectual virtues have nothing directly to do with our action, our moral actions toward other people, right? They have to do with just our understanding of the world. Someone can have intellectual virtue and be not so morally good, right? We imagine the evil genius. They have a very lucid mind. They have many intellectual virtues, but they're bad people because they don't demonstrate moral virtue, something like that. Okay, so we get all these virtues, and then we get this issue of, he talks about the intellectual virtues and what they are, the virtues of mind, right? And then he talks about self-restraint or lack of self-restraint, right? What is self-restraint? What does that mean? What is that all about? Self-restraint.
Having self-control.
Yeah, self-control. Why do human beings need this thing called self-control?
Likely because we know we know how severe we can get in certain situations, but because we know of consequences, we have self-restraint.
Okay, good. Everybody understands self-control.
Acting out on our worst impulses.
Okay, great. So Aristotle has a model of human conduct and of human motivation that's basically, to put it simply, it's a divide. There's two competing forces in our psychology. He uses the word soul, right? The word psychology comes from the Greek word for soul, psyche. That's the Greek word for soul. And when he talks about a soul, he's not talking about some immaterial thing that flies off to heaven when you die. He's talking about your psychology that is something slightly different than your physical body. So a human being has a body and a soul, and your soul includes like your head and your heart. It includes those rational elements of you, and it includes those emotional or passionate elements of you, right? And basically, Aristotle depicts the human soul as a kind of battleground. It's a kind of ongoing conflict between reason and our impulses. And he calls them passions, right? But to use the word passions is just a synonym we would use as emotions or impulses or desires, right? So people who act virtuously, let's just take moral virtue. They act with moral virtue. What have they been able to do? They've been able to restrain their impulses with their reason. And by doing that, they perform the correct action. They do the right thing, right? And the image of someone who does the wrong thing is precisely for Aristotle, someone who's given in to an impulse rather than restrained it, rather than regulated it, right? So for Aristotle, performing a virtuous deed of any kind involves the proper use of your reason in some way to restrain your natural impulses. And of course, the thing we discover is that our impulses want to do stuff. They want to make us do stuff because there's some perception that they're pleasurable to do it, right? Acting out is pleasurable. Losing control has a certain pleasure. But of course, as Tashana said, there are destructive consequences for unleashing our desires. And therefore, we either learn the easy way or we learn the hard way to regulate ourselves, because we discover in the big picture that our happiness is better served by regulating those darker impulses rather than letting them be unleashed, however pleasurable in the moment that might be. And, one argument he makes about the virtuous person is that it would not be pleasurable for them to act out in that negative way or succumb to their impulses, because they'd have a full understanding how that in the big picture, this is not really beneficial for them or those people around them, right? By the same token, he says virtuous people are people who, when they do the right thing, it doesn't come hard, it comes easy, right? I don't know, there's simple examples like the impulse to put your hand in the cookie jar and eat a bunch of cookies rather than doing I don't think he'd call it the virtuous thing, but obviously it's the more healthy thing of not eating the cookies. Or, I could have one beer tonight, or I could have 6 beers. And after you have the one beer, having the other ones becomes easier and easier, and it's harder to restrain yourself, right? So the virtuous person doesn't suffer all the temptation of wanting to do the wrong thing. It's actually, they've been trained, and they have a good character, so it becomes easy for them to do the right thing. And you start to realize that correct action or acting with moral virtue has a lot to do with training. And the more you train to do the right thing, the easier it becomes. And it's a lot of training that's like, it's like sports. So, getting on the treadmill the first time is very painful, even though it's good for you, right? But the more you do it, the easier it becomes. And in time, it doesn't seem like the burden it was the first time you got on there after not being on the treadmill because of COVID lockdowns or something like that. Okay, so he talks about self-restraint, and then he moves into the topic of pleasure. And this is really interesting. So he goes from self-restraint to pleasure, to friendship, to pleasure, and then back to happiness. And this thing, contemplation, right? For Aristotle, doing the right thing is not supposed to be painful. And this is a little bit different than our kind of Christian mentality, like the general ethos of our society, that we envision when people do the right thing, that they don't benefit or shouldn't benefit in any way from what they do, that they should solely do it because it's the right thing, right? And that very often we envision people who are really good or are really excellent morally is that they do things that are selfless and self-sacrificing, where they actually sacrifice benefit for themselves for the sake of another person. And that there's a kind of zero-sum game, that if they're benefiting the other person in the right way, that they're not benefiting themselves. Aristotle, I think, has a very different vision than the kind of self-sacrificing Christian vision. And of course, one of the Latin words that's still in like Catholic liturgy for love, caritas, it means charity, and yet it's translated as love, because how should one love thy neighbor? One should act with charity. One should do things for the other person that don't seem to have any obvious benefit for you. Aristotle's model is a bit different, and this gets into the theme of friendship, which is that when you do the right thing, it doesn't just benefit other people. He clearly recognizes it also it also benefits you. There's a self-interested component to it, and that there's nothing wrong with that, right? I think his deeper issue here is something with human nature. I don't think Aristotle believes that anybody is going to regularly act in a way that doesn't benefit them in some way, right? What do we think about that? Should we regularly expect people to act in a way that doesn't benefit them?
No.
No.
Let me ask this. How many things did you do today that didn't benefit you in some way, shape, or form?
That would be wasting time.
Okay. And I think that's Aristotle's. Well, there are some people, maybe a slightly different point of view than you have, that subscribe to, and I think there's a justification for it, to subscribe to a model that true righteous conduct is really self-sacrificing in a certain way. Like that's the proof that you're really doing the right thing, that you're not benefiting from it yourself. And I think Aristotle, he's not quite, I mean, you almost think of like the Christian martyr, the human being who's willing to die for their principles. And of course they hold on to their principles, but they lose their life, right? Courage might result in dying for your principles, but I think Aristotle would say it has to be a really good cause to be willing to make that kind of sacrifice. And if that may be the equation, that your principles are even more important than your life, depending on what the situation is. But in general, he has a vision of happiness in which we're doing the right thing. And by doing the right thing, it benefits both others, but it also benefits ourselves. What does he say happiness is? He says happiness is living, he says it in a slightly different way. We'll look at it in a moment. But he says happiness is living virtuously. And the question is, living virtuously seems to have to do with some combination of moral virtues and intellectual virtues, right? Because there's a moral component to our soul and there's an intellectual component to our soul. And the thing is, if we live virtuously, if we do things that are right by other people or righteous, we get the best benefit of all for Aristotle. We achieve happiness. And the big thing here is that happiness is not a state of mind alone. It's not a feeling of contentment. It's not, the good life is not sitting out on the beach watching the ocean roll in back and forth with our drink with like the umbrella in it. Happiness is living a certain way and achieving goals, right? I mean, he conceives of it almost, it's almost kind of like athletics, except instead of training for the Super Bowl and executing everything you need to do to win the Super Bowl, you're training to achieve happiness. And it's kind of a work every day you wake up to attempt this. So Humeon disagrees with Aristotle. You disagree with what element that we've talked about so far?
You were saying like that about like you think that Aristotle has sort of this like like that he believes that that human nature is sort of self-serving. I
Well,
think that viewpoint is valid in his
he
time frame.
says, he doesn't use quite this expression, but he acknowledges our self-love, which is that we love
I agree.
ourselves. Because I want you to respond, but let me just clarify. We love I think he makes an argument essentially, we love ourselves the most first, but we also love things that are like us, that are connected to us. And the more the thing is connected to us, the more that it is like us. And the more that it's like us, the more we're going to care about it. So for example, when Aristotle says we're self-interested or we exhibit self-love, he's going to say one way that self-love is manifest is in love for our children. Now, one person would call that selfless, to care about your children, but I think Aristotle correctly acknowledges that there's a selfish motive for caring about your children because of the extent to which they're connected to you and your own destiny. And there's a whole variety of ways. So, you know, you quickly realize as a parent, for example, that you have 1,001 motives for being concerned for your child. That have to do with you, but also, excuse me, that have to do with them, but also have to do with you. So what do you disagree? I mean, feel free. I'm sorry, I cut you off, but
No, I mean, I think like because his view is based on like what he has learned from like his predecessors, what he experiences about humanity and its nature at that moment. And I think the access of knowledge and like the institutions present play a huge role. And I know it goes back to what you're saying about there's always a selfish motive, but it's not really selfish when, I mean, you could say that it's a selfish motive, but when
so
it produces a
I'm being,
win-win situation, it's not
I'm
selfish.
being a little bit devil's advocate when I say selfish. Like selfish always has a negative connotation. And I guess all I want to mean by it is that we accrue some benefit from it somehow. You know, so if a philanthropist, you know, those people who love humanity, who are rich, they give $2 million to a library. You could say, oh, that's selfless because they gave up something they really like, which is their wealth. On the other hand, then when the library takes that money, they chisel that person's name on the stone and it's there for hundreds of years for everybody to see. So they get a benefit in return for their for their action, which benefits others, right? I mean, assuming that's a good library and all that stuff, it's that $2 million is going to be for the benefit of, I don't know, New York City or society at large, what have you. So I think Aristotle just sees it as a win-win rather than good conduct as a win for the other person and a sacrifice for us.
I mean, the thing with my problem with that is like, it's always gonna be kind of win-win, and you can't like, and I see I feel like you can't look at it that way, just mostly because like it's not it's for the greater, it creates greater good. Like heroes don't create civilizations, like destroyers do, conquerors do. They create societies, right? But it's not of their own action, like of good intention. But what comes of it is good. So I'm trying to say like people could have all these motives, right? But what comes of these things is like, So then the argument, like my real argument is like, it's kind of about intention and action, but in reality, it's about like what happens after with what happened. Because you could say Genghis Khan is terrible, but look at what he did.
Okay, I mean, so you're
And-
getting into a little different topic now. I mean, Aristotle's argument is that, like, I think implicitly, because it's subtly spelled out throughout the text. I don't think he envisions that there is such thing as a good action toward others that doesn't also have some type of benefit
Oh, yeah.
for you. I mean, let's
Yeah.
be clear. When he talks about relationships of friends, he talks about loving the other person for who they are rather than other benefits you get. We'll look at it, but then there's the issue of intentions, and sometimes diabolical people do things that in the course of history actually end up being advantageous in a way that nobody could have anticipated. Um, what do people think Aristotle has to say on intentions? Do intentions matter for what matters more for Aristotle, intentions or actions?
Intentions.
Actions.
Action.
Think is action.
Actions.
Both, but action is more for him.
Okay, so someone says both.
Yeah.
Both.
So the
Yeah, both.
answer when you get into books 2 and 3, and then I want to say it's book, oh, where is it? I think it's book 4, or not book 4, it's book 6. It's number 4 here, right? The answer is both. So the one thing Aristotle definitely does not agree with is that good intentions alone count for something, right? Aristotle would be the guy to say the road to hell is paved with good intentions. There were other schools of thought, moral thought after him, like the Stoics, and then even in Christian thinking, that put a much greater emphasis on intentions, and that if someone had the right intention, even if they ended up with a negative result, that they still should be respected as having at least thought of trying to do the right thing. So Aristotle says you have to do the right thing in the right way for the right reasons, right? So he's actually really specific. But the key thing is, I mean, if you don't do the right thing, whatever's in your mind that you think you're doing is going to be irrelevant. But it's interesting. He puts a burden on all parts of it. That one has to do something for the right reasons. One has to see why what one's doing is for the right reason. Think about, like, anyone seen the Pink Panther with Inspector Clouseau? Anyone see those movies? Might have a generational divide here. Tell me anyway. So nobody's seen the Pink Panther movies? That's a negative.
With Beyonce, I think I saw it.
Okay.
You mean Black Panther? Oh.
So there's an inspector.
Pink Panther, right?
Yeah, yes.
I saw it.
So there's an inspector, Inspector Clouseau. He's a French police chief played by the British actor Peter Sellers, and he's very ridiculous and funny. Anyway, Inspector Clouseau is a buffoon. He's an idiot, and the other chief inspector hates him because he's an idiot. But the thing about Inspector Clouseau is he will do the wrong things for the wrong reason, and he will manage to solve the crime. He will do the dumbest, most backward thing, and he will, like, back up and stumble over the killer by accident and wrap up the case and solve the mystery without trying to do it because he's got, like, incredibly dumb luck, something like that. So Aristotle would say Inspector Clouseau is not a model of virtue just because he managed to solve the crime, because he really had no clue what he was doing. He just has this kind of unnatural luck to solve the mystery in spite of himself, right? And that's part of the charm of the character, the way he does this. Okay, good. So the key thing here is, for Aristotle, like, virtue, being virtuous is not like this great self-sacrifice that makes you miserable, right? There's a pleasure to be found in it, right? And a real pleasure, like, it feels good. But the interesting thing is he doesn't simply associate happiness with pleasure, because happiness has to do with the actions. Or maybe you could argue that the pleasure and the actions are inseparable from one another. I don't know. Imagine someone dancing. They are acting, but they are also feeling the experience of the dancing, and the feeling and the actions in a sense are kind of inseparable. But he definitely puts an emphasis on the activity or the action or the living part of it. So then he talks about friendship, right? And then the big question becomes, what does friendship have to do with happiness? It should be clear by now, it should, at least implicitly, that if the goal of human life is happiness, and happiness is living virtuously, it seems clear that friends are somehow, you might even call them, they're going to be teammates in the game of life where we're trying to achieve this goal called happiness. We're going to work with them. We're going to rely on them. We're going to depend on them in a variety of ways, right? Because people don't just magically become virtuous and stay virtuous. It's a lot of work. And this is interesting that he puts a lot of burden of happiness. Happiness is not the result of chance. Happiness is not the result of dumb luck. Happiness is not the result of just being born into riches or born into an elite circumstance. Happiness is something you earn, and something that you only get from a type of serious toil, right? Okay. Let's talk about this for a second. So we'll go maybe 15 more minutes and we'll just read a couple key passages. So Aristotle calls happiness living well. He calls happiness the highest human good, right? And he has this concept of a good, which is just the name for something we think we desire because it's beneficial to us. And there's the appearance of something being good, and then there's the reality of it. And one of the challenges of human happiness, as we're kind of sussing out here, is that many things appear good to us that after we've experienced them or tried them out, it turns out not to be perfectly the case, right? So there's a variety of types of goods connected with his discussion here. And there's two sets. I should go back to this one because this is more basic. There are two sets of goods that we really need to have a grasp of in this first chapter. So there are goods that he says that are ends. Well, I'll explain what this means. There are goods that are means. It should be 1, 2, 3. I'm sorry about that little typo here. There are goods that are means, and there are goods that are means and ends. A good that is an end is the thing that you're after. It's the thing that you want. It's the thing that you want to achieve. And it's the destination of all your actions. And there's nothing beyond it that you want. It's not an instrument to get something else. I'll come back to that. And he's going to describe it things as ends in themselves or things that are good in themselves. A means is pretty simple. A means is an instrument that you use to get an end, like a means to an end, right? You've heard that expression. Or the end doesn't justify any means. Or on the other hand, the end justifies the means, like attributed to Machiavelli. So a means is a tool you use to achieve your goals, and your goals are your ends. And a good that is a means and ends just happens to be both. It's good for something else, and it's also good in and of itself. I think the best way to clarify the meaning of these things is to just think of examples. What's a good that's an end in itself, that we want it for nothing else, for no other purpose?
What was the question?
What is a good that we want for its own sake and not for any other thing that it might produce that's beneficial to us? in our lives? Can you think of an example? Let me put it this way. I'll give you an example that's not an end in itself. Is brushing your teeth an end in itself? Do you like to brush your teeth simply for the sake of brushing your teeth?
I guess no.
I guess no, me too. I was thinking no.
Yeah, come on, folks. Is there anyone here who likes brushing their teeth?
I do, and I spend at least 5 to 7 minutes brushing my teeth.
Oh my goodness, and your teeth are still
I
there?
was a dental
I love
assistant.
it.
and
I just love it.
That's fine. I do too. Okay.
30 minutes.
The whole
Right,
thing, the tongue, the gums, everything.
30
You
minutes is a
gotta
long
go easy on
time.
the enamel though. Boy. You're gonna have no teeth left if you brush too
Use
much.
another example, Professor.
Okay. So I would say most people are not crazy about brushing their teeth. And then you ask the people, well, if you don't like brushing your teeth, why the heck do you do it every day? Simple thinking here.
Because you know that there's consequences that come with a dirty mouth. There's so much bacteria in there.
Okay, and let's frame it in a positive way. I
Because
don't brush my teeth because I like doing it for its own sake. I do it because X.
I do it because I know I have healthy teeth.
Yeah, sure. I know I have a healthy mouth, right?
Right.
I don't like getting on the treadmill. It's like torture, but I know it's good for me. So this thing that I don't like for itself is good for some other good that's beyond it. Do we see the difference here? So
Yes.
for most people, brushing teeth is a means to an end. It's an instrument to the end of a healthy mouth, right? And then there's some people who like it for its own sake, and it's an end in itself. And I guess I suppose it's nice that your teeth are clean and healthy, but you really just like brushing your teeth because brushing your teeth is like so awesome, right? Something like that.
So working out, Professor, would be considered means to an end. So working out.
Yeah,
would
in my description of it, describing it as like, oh my God, it's suffering. I can't get, I hate this treadmill. I don't want to be here right now. I want to look at my phone and call my friends and look at social media, right?
But
Something like that. Of
but
course,
the
there are other people who love physical exercise and it's not painful, right? Because their bodies are trained to it, and it's just like people who like to run miles outside, right?
So working out, the means to an end would be considered good health and good body muscles, right?
Yeah,
Is that what-
sure. So we'll talk more about these. You get a whole hierarchy of goods out of these descriptions. You get goods that are means to other goods. So just as an example, it varies slightly from person to person, but I don't work out as an end in itself. I work out because it makes me strong. It makes me healthy. It's good for my heart. I look better, and then people look at me, and I like people to look at me, and that makes me happy. That makes my social life better, and you could start seeing any number of other goods that emerge out of working out. Whereas working out becomes just a means to get to those other things, and it's those other things that you really want, as opposed to the working out, right? So goods that are means are often described, like I think Plato describes them as onerous goods, And something that's onerous is like kind of painful and laborious. It's something that is good for you, and it's not actually satisfying in and of itself, but you do it anyway because it benefits other things, right? So I suppose everybody could come up with something that they do because they know it's the right thing to do, despite the fact that they really can't stand doing it, right? A good that's an end, that's the thing you really want. That's the thing you really want. We could ask this. We haven't read books 8 and 9. Are friends, are they means? Friends are a good. So for Aristotle, a friend is a type of a good. It's something that's beneficial, right? Are friends means or are they ends?
I want to say means.
So they're like instruments. So we use our friends to get something that they can provide us. What do we think? What is friendship a means to?
I'm kind of stuck with that one.
Are friendship are friends means, or are they an end in themselves? What we're really asking here is
I would say means.
the thing is, what we're really asking here, to make it simplify it a bit, is what do we really want from friendship? Do we want what the friends provide as a means, or do we want their company in and of itself? We want to be with them for their own sake. We want to be with them to be with them and not for any other additional reason.
Could it be both?
Okay, it could be both. If friends are a means, if they're an instrument to achieve other goals beyond friendship, what might they be? What might those goals be? Any thoughts?
Would it be companionship?
Well, I mean, companionship would be the friendship itself. It would be the relationship with the person. So I think if you say your goal is companionship, you're saying that you're treating the friend as an end in themselves. Because I don't know how, I mean, we could slice it finer here, but I don't know how you'd separate the friend from the companionship, or the friend from the relationship.
Could you say it as if let's say if you were in a work area, like you have friends, and so that would be an end, but you also have those friends as a means in terms of, like, let's say connections or something, like your colleagues.
Okay, good. I mean, so this issue of whether a friend is a means or an end, it first raises the question of what do we mean by a friend? Because of course, if we take the term in the more general, broadest sense of a friend, we call all kinds of people friends. And there's a whole range of connections we have, from mere acquaintances to deep, BFF, personal, intimate relationships. So there are definitely, let's just say that it's both for now. There are some people we meet, it's transactional. We need something from them. We're nice to them. They're nice to us. We call them a friend, but we don't call them on the phone every night. We don't have them over for a beer or for dinner or for a movie. But when we see them, we're nice to each other, and we ask them what's going on at work, or what assignment is due, because I forgot. And I just, you pay attention in class all the time, so I'll ask you. So it's a mixture, and it depends on the relationship, right? And this is going to, in book 8, this is going to be a big theme for Aristotle, understanding exactly what we're getting from the relationship. What is it, right? And we'll discover that in each relationship we have, we're getting something different. And the person involved with us is either going to be more a means or more an end, that we want to be with them for their own sake rather than simply what they provide. So then the last one here, number 3 rather than number 2, is goods that are both means and ends. So that's a tricky one. But Aristotle is going to say this, that happiness is activity in accord with virtue. And he's going to say that virtuous activity, and what he means, I know it's just, why does he talk this way? When he says virtuous activity, he means living virtuously, very simply, living the right way, in accord with these virtues that he lists in the middle of the text. And when he says, he'll say that living virtuously, or what he calls virtuous activity, is a good that is both a means and an end. It's an end because it's good in and of itself, but it's also a means. What is living virtuously a means to for Aristotle?
Doing the right things, but
Well,
doing certain actions,
living virtuously is doing the right thing.
but towards other people.
That would be part of living virtuously. He says it's a good in and of itself, but he also says it's a means to something else. Moral virtue, by definition, is doing right to other people, or just doing the right thing and benefiting other people by doing the right thing, directly or indirectly. What is living virtuously produce for Aristotle? What does it achieve for us?
Happiness.
Yes.
Happiness.
Virtuous activity or living virtuously for him is a means to happiness. A means to happiness. Okay, good. Okay. So then these are concepts that emerge in the text. He doesn't sit there and spell these things out. And that's why I'm doing it. Because once you see these things spelled out, it becomes clearer. So implicit in his discussion, there are three types of goods which emerge. And these three types of goods are really going to be essential in book 8. In book 8, when he talks about 3 different types of relationships or 3 different types of friendships. And those 3 different types of friendships roughly are going to be based on these 3 different types of goods. So he says there's goods of the soul, there are goods of the body, and there are external goods. And let's start with the last one first, because it's the one we're all most familiar with. So external goods are stuff, wealth, property, possessions you have, house, car, money, clothes, right? All those tangible possessions that are instruments to your own well-being. So someone mentioned it earlier, money. Is money a good that's a means or an end?
It's a means.
Okay, so one person, Sophia says it's a means. Why is it a means?
Because it's a tool to achieve happiness, I would say.
Well, how does money achieve you happiness?
Well, okay.
Because let me put it this way. Aristotle doesn't say happiness is success in making lots of money. And in fact, his vision of happiness is going to be very different from our vision, or at least not very different, but there are going to be some important differences between our vision of success, right? Our notion of success, we get the good job, we make the money, we have the house and all that, you know, and we achieve certain things. Not quite the same thing. How does money, what is money a means to?
Wealth.
Yeah, money. I would just say we use those interchangeably. Money and wealth, basically the same. I mean, I suppose wealth includes things that are not cash, so that's true. What do you do with money? Is money an end in itself? You keep it around?
You buy things.
You use it to survive, basically.
Right.
Yeah, I'm asking a really basic question. What the hell do you do with money? What do you do
You
with
buy things.
You spend it.
And then
Exactly. You buy shit with it because you don't want the money. You want what it can buy, right? And if you're really rich, you can go out and buy love and stuff like that, right? So, I mean, how do you know you don't really care about money? Because when you get it, you get rid of it for other things, right? It's funny. So, people who set fire to money, that won't be me, at least not anytime soon. So yeah. What does Aristotle think? Is wealth an end in itself? Does wealth make people happy? Anyone pick up anything on that?
So basically, no, wealth does not make people happy.
And then the real kicker for Aristotle, the question is, why does wealth not make people happy? So when we hear this argument that wealth doesn't make people happy, it always comes with someone, well, criticizing greed or things of that sort. What's the problem for money with money for Aristotle? Why does it
Well,
not bring
it
happiness?
could be corrupted. How you use it.
Yeah, it could be corrupting. What else? Let's
It has no value. It's just used for like personal gain or just to have it and just to spend it. It doesn't qualify for any value.
Really?
okay. And so let's just clarify what Carrie's saying. Money doesn't have any value. So obviously we know that in the world of stuff, money has value. So she's saying that in the dimension that really matters of value, money doesn't value.
Professor,
Yes,
I can give you a good example. I was just watching an interview yesterday.
sure.
I'm really into sport, specifically baseball, and there was a baseball player. He was saying like how they in the minor they go through a lot, and he was saying how sometimes he had the money to buy food and he was starving. He was hungry because there was nowhere to buy food. So money, like she was saying, money is nothing unless you have the opportunity to get something that is real.
Yeah, and of course, then you're talking about an issue of like a country where the money is worthless. I don't know, like Venezuela or Germany in the 1930s, where the money was people would like buy things with like a wheelbarrow full of Deutschmarks and stuff like that. Um, well, why is money? Aristotle's not going to quite say money's worthless, and he's not critical of wealth, right? But he's also going to say, well, let's put it this way: money can't buy you happiness. Aristotle effectively will say that. He doesn't say it that way. I'm just kind of putting a bumper sticker on it here. It should be clear, why can't money buy happiness for Aristotle? What is happiness again?
Living virtuously.
Yes, living virtuously. There's no way for Aristotle that you can, well, there are a couple minor exceptions, because he has a virtue called liberality. And liberality is really a form of generosity, of helping people out. And it's a type of virtue. So, for example, you could donate money theoretically to someone, and that would be kind of virtuous. But on the whole, money can't make you act virtuously. Only you, in your reason, can act virtuously by restraining your lesser impulses, right? He certainly says that wealth makes life easier. I think we all know that. Particularly, it provides a necessary context in which to act virtuously, right? And we're not talking about, when I use the word wealth, I don't mean like obscene riches. I just mean having the necessities of life. So imagine, for example, the guy who's homeless, who has $0, nothing. And he goes in and steals a loaf of bread. Stupid question. Why does he steal a loaf of bread?
He's hungry.
Because he's hungry and he doesn't have the money to buy it. So what does he do? He does something that's not exactly right, but we're not going to criticize him so much because he's hungry and it's just a loaf of bread and he's not hurting anyone. But the problem is, for Aristotle, you have to have your basic needs met. You have to kind of liberate yourself from the realm of necessity, of the basic needs of life, to then act virtuously. And the big thing is, for him, virtuous actions come from choices rather than being forced to do the right thing. Aristotle makes an interesting argument in books 2 and 3. He says, a virtuous action only comes from you making a choice. if someone forces you to do something that turns out, or has a gun to your head, you could say, and forces you to do something that turns out to be the quote unquote right thing, you actually haven't done anything virtuous. If you think about it, if the person has the gun to your head, you're not doing it because it's the right thing you do. You're doing it because you want to stay alive, right? There was a very funny moment. Probably nobody, you guys have like long moved past this, and I don't know how much you guys pay attention to current events, but Hillary Clinton, when she was running for the 2016 election, that seems like several lifetimes ago at this point. She had this whole email scandal with her server, an email server that had emails on it that nobody knows what was really on them. It's a big mystery. Anyway, she came out in public. What she was asked about them, and there was a criminal investigation into them. And she came out one day to make a press conference announcement to try to cope with the situation, because obviously it was causing problems on the campaign trail for her. And it could have well been the thing that lost her the election if it wasn't the Russians, you know, because the Russians stole the election. So she came out and said, well, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to give my emails to the FBI, right? I'm going to give my emails to the FBI. And she made it sound like she was performing this great virtuous deed. The only problem is she left out a key detail, which is that the FBI had subpoenaed her emails, which means they, under law, compelled her to turn over her emails. And if you don't turn over what you're subpoenaed to turn over, effectively you're breaking the law, right? So she wanted to kind of present this image that she was doing this voluntarily and virtuously, when in fact she was being forced to do it and threatened with, you know, the penalties that come with breaking the law. So Aristotle says that virtue is done freely. It's done through choice. Okay, so external goods, goods of the body, really simple. Goods of the body are things like health, beauty, strength, agility. They're things that are, you know, beneficial to have for your body. And then goods of the soul are what? Goods of the soul, or your psychology or yourself, are the moral and intellectual virtues, right? So goods of the soul are things achieved by the use of your reason, and the goods of the soul are by definition the moral and intellectual virtues, because the moral and intellectual virtues are by definition virtues of the soul. So goods of the soul is just another way of talking about virtues of the soul. For the Greeks, you know, a human being has a soul and have a body, and there are virtues of the soul and there are virtues of the body. Virtues of the body are like goods of the body, things like health, beauty, strength. You think of like virtues of the body, like what athletes are capable of doing. They demonstrate all types of virtues, physical virtues. That's another way of putting it. And goods of the soul are psychological virtues. Okay, let's, in the time we have left here, let's move to chapter 5. Where do I have it? Where do I have it? I'll just bring it up on this. Just 1 second. Oh, not chapter 5. Oh, I'm sorry. 1 second here.
You mean book 5, chapter 5, Professor?
No. Book 1.
Book 1, okay.
Book 1, chapter 5.
Okay.
Right here.
Okay.
Is this big enough for everybody to see? So this is page 6, right?
Yes.
All right. So we're going to get an overview of, it's often called the 3 lives. And it's 3 different lives, 3 different ways of living that are candidates for what people think happiness is, right? Could somebody read this for us? A little bigger here. There. Who would like to read for us?
I'll read. Where do I start?
Okay. Beginning at chapter 5, let us speak from the point where we digressed.
Let us speak from the point where we digressed, for on the basis of the lives they had, the many and the crudest seem to suppose, not unreasonably, that the good and happiness are pleasure, and thus they cherish the life of enjoyment. For the especially prominent ways of life are 3. The one just mentioned, the political, and third, the contemplative.
Okay.
Okay.
So this is really crucial, and this is going to be important when we look at our discussion of friendship. So he talks about, basically what he's saying is that there's 3 candidates. He seems to be doing this. It's like, if I took a survey of society, there would be 3 general categories. At least we could say his society, but maybe our society too. There would be 3 general categories of what people claim happiness is. And it, depending on who I talk to in society, there are general groupings that he has of society. He gets different answers about what they think happiness is. And the 3 candidates, the 3 opinions that are out there in society are these. The 3 ways of life that bring us happiness are, he says, the one that was just mentioned. So you see how confusing Aristotle can be. Does anyone realize the way of life he just mentioned? What was it?
Happiness.
So here's the thing. When we get to these 3 lives, it's this. We all know we want happiness. The question is, what do we mean by happiness? And these are 3 different candidates for what we mean by happiness. And he says the 3 most prominent ways of life, or the 3 that people generally consider could be human happiness, are, number 1, he says the one just mentioned. And then he says the political life and the contemplative life. So instead of repeating the one just mentioned, he refers you back to what he previously said as the first candidate for what happiness is. Why don't I read it again? We'll try to wrap up as soon as we can here. Let us speak from the point where we digressed. He went on a digression. For on the basis of the lives they lead, the many and crudest seem to suppose, not unreasonably, that the good and happiness are pleasure, and thus they cherish the life of enjoyment. For the especially prominent ways of life are 3. These are the 3 dominant ways people live in society. And the way they live is obviously characteristic of what they think happiness is. Everyone,
Pleasure.
Yes, pleasure. So that's the first one. So think about it. You live your life according to your own conception of happiness. I mean, that's necessarily true, right? As you get older, as you have more experiences, you modify it, you tweak it, you change it. But we all live the life we lead because either it's making us happy or we believe it's going to make us happy. So the 3 primary candidates are pleasure, the political life, and the contemplative life. Rather odd. So let me say a little more about it. When he talks about pleasure, what kind of pleasure do you think he's talking about? Because he doesn't specify. It turns out there are many different types of pleasure, right?
Yes. One is sex, right?
What kind of pleasure does he's talking about? It turns out he's talking about something pretty simple here, What do you what kind of pleasure do you think he's talking about?
Living well.
So living well is like a synonym for happiness, and happiness still needs a definition. So here we get three potential definitions. We get pleasure, the political life, and the contemplative life, right? What kind of pleasure do you think he's talking about? Notice what he says. So first of all, he talks about the many and the crudest. So he divides society, almost like a sociologist, into the few and the many. And the few and the many could have some different meanings. The few could be the few rich and the many not so rich. The few could be the few educated and the many not so educated. This is his world in ancient Greece. And this is what it looks like. The few could be the few rational and the many who are passionate and don't have self-control, right? What does it mean to be crude? What does it mean to be crude? He says the many and the crudest. What does he mean by, what does it mean to be crude?
And the crudest.
What does it mean to be crude? I mean, we know this word.
Be mean?
Crude, evil,
Not necessarily evil.
Mean.
disrespectful, mean,
Oh yeah, that's right.
nasty.
Yeah. Well, then, why are people disrespectful? Because they have no, we could say, manners, right?
Mhm.
So I think what he means by crude is, and he's speaking from a slightly aristocratic point of view, and it might not have a pleasant ring to our ears, right? But he's speaking about people who aren't educated, who aren't sufficiently civilized, who don't have good manners. They're rude and crude and rough around the edges. The Greeks would call these people the hoi polloi. They're kind of like the unwashed masses, right? So the many, most people, the majority of people, and also the crudest, meaning like he'll talk about other people have refinement, right? People who are crude lack refinement. They lack education. They lack manners. They lack discipline, things of that sort. So the many and the crudest, although it's not unreasonable, they think that happiness is pleasure. And let's just clarify, he's gonna make it clear in the next paragraph that pleasure means pleasures of the body, pleasures of the body, like drinking, like eating, like sex, like dancing, right? Who could disagree with that, right? That's
Man, I agree.
happiness in a nutshell, right? But
Mhm.
what's the issue here? For an animal, bodily pleasure is just great, right? But we're not any ordinary animal. We're a rational animal. We have reason. And therefore, the pleasures that are going to satisfy us as human beings have to be something more than just bodily pleasure. Otherwise, for Aristotle, we're just acting like an animal, right? It's an interesting argument, and you might disagree with it. Let me just say something. So, for Aristotle, a human being is not simply one that has a genetic code of Homo sapien. It's not just a being that walks upright and wears clothes. A human being for him is one that fully realizes all its potentials as a human being. And when I say as a human being, I mean realizes its potentials that are distinct from other animals, right? A human being has reason. Therefore, a human being that's realized its potentials is one that's used its reason to live its life and to develop its moral and intellectual virtue, right? Happiness is living virtuously. That's really another way of saying living excellently. It's not enough to just go through the motions in life as genetically a human being. A full human being is the person who cultivates their moral and intellectual virtue to their best abilities, given their circumstances and given their raw abilities, right? So pleasure, for Aristotle, he's not going to completely, he doesn't have, he's not a Christian here. He's not speaking about original sin and the sinfulness of the body and things of that sort. And he's not denigrating pleasure completely, but what he does do is subordinate pleasure to other higher goods in his mind, like moral and intellectual virtue, right? So then the second way of life is the political life. And that seems a little odd to us. But for Aristotle's world, politics was the central, most distinguishing activity someone could engage in. So if you wanted attention, if you wanted fame, if you wanted quote unquote success, the realm of politics was kind of the ultimate stage of life on which you'd go to achieve things and to be as an ambitious person, to show yourself to the world and get accolades, and also just do important things, right? And then the third one is the contemplative life. The contemplative. What the heck is the contemplative life? What does that consist of?
Being satisfied.
Not by its, it might be satisfying. What is the contemplative life?
So you said political has to do with like ambitiously achieving things or like.
Yeah, and it's going to turn out, so think about it for a second. The life of pleasure is the life of the body, and it's going to desire, that life is going to desire bodily goods. We just talked about bodily goods, like drinking, eating, so on and so forth. The political life for Aristotle, as he understands it, is going to be very caught up with moral virtue, because politics is about interacting with your fellow citizens and about doing things that are the right things, that also, not only are they the right things to do, but you gain recognition from your fellow citizens, and you gain, as a result of that, reputation. The contemplative life might be a little foreign to us. So Humayun says introspection. I think he's on the right track. What is Aristotle? What's his profession? What's his discipline? Not that
philosopher.
Not that I've said it. He's a philosopher. What is Aristotle going to say? That the third candidate for happiness is the life of contemplation, aka the life of philosophy. What does the life of philosophy consist of? It consists of introspection or contemplation, reflection
Like
on things,
deep thoughts.
Deep thoughts about big things, about the nature of things, the nature of human beings, the nature of the world around us, what it's all about. It's a process of trying to understand the world around us, and it's not the life. The relationship of that life to moral virtue is an interesting question, but it's the life of intellectual virtue. It's the life of study.
So it's reflecting in studies and okay.
And you know what? So today, the whole model of like professorial tenure at a university is supposed to provide a context for a professor so that they can engage in free inquiry, like no censorship, no speech codes, no limitations on what they can investigate. And tenure is designed to create an environment, and the university is designed to create an environment in which professors can engage in the life of contemplation as we understand it today. Like, oh, this professor is a sociologist. They do research into, class relationships in New York City or whatever it is, right? But it's the life less of action and more of understanding and intellectual virtue, where obviously politics is a life of action. You go and do stuff, you make decisions that have consequences, and you do them with other people, and it engages you with other people. Whereas contemplation is a little bit different, and it's the life of the mind, right? And you can start to see why it seems very strange that this would be a definition of happiness, right? Sounds, I don't know, it's maybe boring.
So how do you incorporate it to happiness, contemplative life?
Well, that's a good question.
Because basically you say it's reflecting in studies, right?
Yes.
Your deep thoughts about nature and of human beings. So how do you incorporate that with being happy? Learning about other people?
What is a human being for Aristotle? For Aristotle, there's a little section, book 1, chapter 7. We don't have time to look at it right now, but book 1, chapter 7. He tries to articulate what a human being is as distinct from other animals, right?
Okay.
And he talks about plants, and he talks about animals like large mammals, like horses and stuff. And then he talks about human beings. And the thing that differentiates the human being from the animal is that we have reason, right?
Yes.
And for Aristotle, the more we use our reason, or that the more that we reason in life, in the ways that he describes throughout the text, the more we're engaging in a distinctly human life. Unlike the animal, we don't just respond instinctually to pleasure and pain. That for an animal, their actions are generated by responses to external stimuli of pleasure and pain. For the rational animal, we don't just have instinctual responses to the external stimuli. We make choices, and we make choices with our reason, and we reason about things. And the more we utilize our reason, the more we're leading it, for Aristotle, a distinctly human as opposed to animal. He knows we're an animal. He's not pretending like we're some type of supernatural being, but where he calls us the rational animal. When he uses the word animal, the Greek word is zoon. It's where we get our word zoo. And you know it goes in zoos, animals, not human beings. So he knows very clearly that we have our body rooted in the animal world. But we're a special type of animal that has reason and speech. And the more we cultivate our rational faculties, the more we cultivate our moral and intellectual virtues, the more we distinguish ourselves as human beings, the more human we are. And the less we use it, the less human we are. And what life uses our reason more and more completely than the life of philosophy, understood in this broad sense that we've talked about. A life of inquiry, a life of understanding, a life of learning is really what he's saying. And not necessarily in a classroom, right? The whole conception of the university didn't exist when Aristotle's writing this. And education was not nearly as formal as it is now. But Aristotle says something really important in another book called The Metaphysics. He says, because the human being is a rational animal, he says all human beings desire to know. All human beings desire to know and to understand, precisely because we have the cognitive ability to understand things. He says we actually have a natural desire to want to know things and to figure things out. And that's another word for curiosity. We're naturally curious to learn about the world because we have reason, because we have the ability to learn about the world. Simple as that. So for Aristotle, and sometimes students are shocked by this, and I get why. For him, in some people, the desire to understand is just as powerful as the desire for sex, or as the desire to drink a glass of wine, or the desire for, I don't know, good pizza or whatever it is, right? Some people operate with their stomachs, and some people operate with things lower than that, right? And some people operate with this thing. And so the the desire for knowledge for Aristotle and Plato too is a desire on par with desire for food, desire for drink. And of course it varies from person to person. Like, for example, I remember I said, like, he's envisioning a human being who desires understanding the way other people desire sex, right? And a girl raised her hand and said, how could anybody want anything? How could they want something more than sex? Like, how could there be something more desirable than having sex? Right? But Aristotle envisions that, right? And what does it depend on? It depends on who you are, right? And that's exactly why we have these three definitions of happiness, because different groups of people in society with different natures and different backgrounds of education, they have developed desires for different things and they live in accord with them. Which one does Aristotle think is best? Which way of life?
The last one.
How do you know? I agree.
Because it includes wisdom and learning about life, utilizing the best capabilities of a human being.
Okay, exactly. For him, the highest, most significant and distinctive capability for the human being is reason, and therefore the contemplative life involves the fullest, most complete use of our reason. And in book 10, he makes it clear that what he thinks happiness is involves contemplation. And he doesn't say it completely until book 10. But let's read the rest of this paragraph, because there's some interesting things he says that are going to contribute to his understanding of friendship. Who is reading for us? We'll just go a few more minutes here. Who is reading for us? And if they're not here anymore, can we get another volunteer?
I'll read it, Professor.
Go for it, Cynthia. Because he
Now,
said some really juicy things here.
I like juicy. Okay.
Good.
Now, in choosing a life of fatted cattle, the many appear altogether slavish, but they attain a hearing, because many people in positions of authority experience passions like those of Sardanapalus.
Sardanapalus or Sardanapalus, great. So he says, now he goes back over it. Once he's introduced these three, he now fleshes them out a little bit more, right, in this paragraph. And he says, now, this is really cruel and dismissive and arrogant. In choosing a life of fatted cattle, the many, when he says the many, he's talking about the majority of people. That's what he means by the many, right? The many what? The many people in society, in his society. He says they appear altogether slavish, right? If we think back to the politics, he talks a little bit about what makes for a master and what makes for a slave. And he doesn't speak about it specifically in terms of, well, the law just dictates that some people are masters and some people are slaves. He says that mastery and slavery has nothing to do with the law. It has to do with the use of your rational faculties. And those people who don't use their rational faculties are slaves. And that means that elite people who seem very powerful and very free are actually slaves intellectually, because his whole conception of slavery here is an intellectual one or a psychological one rather than a political one dealing with property, right? He does have a bit of a relationship to them in the politics between those two definitions, if you read all of book 1 of the Politics. So look what he calls the many. They live the life of fatted cattle. Let me be really cruel. I don't know. They sit around eating potato chips in front of their television, drinking beer. Doesn't sound so bad sometimes, right? And so why are they slaves? Can anyone figure out why the people who who think bodily pleasure is the highest form of pleasure that means equals happiness. What makes them slaves? Any thoughts about that?
Because there's no progression.
What do you mean?
As in like they're only thinking in a certain type of way. They're not exploring the option of maybe there's something more.
Absolutely, absolutely. So they're slaves to what?
Could it be that they're like closed-minded, so they're not really using their intellect, or no?
Well, yeah, basically, and of course, it's no surprise that they're not open to, right? They're obviously not open to using their intellect in the way that he is concerned with. Absolutely. So that's part of the problem, because they're stuck on their bodies rather than their minds and their souls. And of course, we all know why. I mean, he even acknowledges the significance of physical pleasure,
Because
right?
they want instant gratification.
Okay, so that's getting there. And Jim says it. He says they're slaves to their more basic desires, right? And there's a classic expression coming from the ancient world that has perpetuated to the present. People who are a slave to their passions, a slave to their passions. And here we're specifically talking about desires of the body, like bodily pleasures, right? But the person who's a slave to their passions is someone who only or most of the time gives in to their impulses, despite the fact that those impulses may not be the best for them. And obviously, Aristotle's argument as to why these impulses are not the best for you is that there's more to you as a human being than just bodily pleasures. So notice here, he's not really condemning bodily pleasures as negative. He's not a humbug. He's not a guy who wants you to like live a puritanical existence, right? He understands the value of pleasure. The only problem is when you mistake bodily pleasure for being the end all and be all of human life. And is the same criticism he has with money. The problem with people who just pursue wealth is that they mistake wealth for happiness. And wealth for Aristotle is just a tool to provide you with things you need to achieve higher level things, right? If you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, going from like the most foundational animal necessities to the higher psychological and emotional needs. Really, a lot of that is modeled off of Aristotle right here. Okay, so he calls them the life of fatted cattle. Like they all think the same. They're a big herd. Cattle, they just kind of like mosey around. They go wherever the food is. They don't have a mind of their own. This is a very cruel. Speaking of crude, it's a cruel image here of these fat cattle that have been eating. Just what do cattle do? Think about what cattle do. They eat and they eat and they eat and they sleep, and I guess they go to the bathroom, and then they get slaughtered, right? It's a rather cruel image. But then the example he gives comes from this character Sardanapalus. And Sardanapalus is he's a historical figure. He was a famous Assyrian kind of a king or an emperor in ancient Mesopotamia. And actually there's a famous story about him that he was a very decadent ruler who didn't care about his people. He only cared about what? His own desires. And therefore he was a slave to his passions. And instead of doing the things that he needed to do to maintain his people, to maintain his community, he basically lived off the community so he could satisfy his own personal desires. And many of the desires were like physical pleasures. And the famous story about him is that, actually you see footnote 23 talks about a life of sensual indulgences. And the crazy thing about him is there was an invading army coming to, try to conquer his kingdom. And instead of putting up a fight, he famously just like destroyed his concubines, killed his concubines and his servants, and I think like set fire to his palace because he didn't want to be bothered with fighting a war. And I don't know if that part of the story is true or a kind of fiction invention, but it just helps to illustrate like he really didn't care. He didn't care about moral virtue. He didn't care about doing what was right. He just cared about his own pleasures in a very selfish way. So it's funny, he talks about the many being like the many ordinary people who don't have access to education, but then the main example he gives is actually a very elite person who is a slave to their passions. Um, let's finish this paragraph and we'll call it a night. Cynthia, could you keep going?
Yes, sir. The refined, active.
The
no,
refined and active.
The refined and active, on the other hand, choose honor. for
Okay,
this
let's
is
just, I hate to say it, but let's stop right there. Now he's talking about a different group of people. Remember, these three opinions of happiness emanate from different like demographic segments of the society, right? He does just what like the media does today, divides the society up into kind of different demographic groups. He's talking about now the refined and the active. Now notice that refined is an antonym to crude. There are the crude in society and there are the refined. What do we mean? What do you think he means by refined?
The more elegant, the more, successful and I guess human beings who know what they want.
Okay, good. And what do you think are the factors that make these people refined rather than crude? And it's
The
just
political life. Those are the ones from the political life, right?
they're going to end up in the political life.
Okay.
And they're going to end up there largely because they're refined. And my question is, and it's the same today to a great extent, not absolutely, because there's always fluctuation in any society. What permits these people to be refined? Let me ask this: were they born that way?
I don't think so.
No.
Are you born having proper manners?
No, you're taught.
Yeah, so these people have the education to have been refined human beings, right? So the fact that the many are crude is not exactly their fault. They don't have access to the things that would refine their characters, right? Remember, character has to do with habituating someone to have good character. To be habituated properly, you need a good environment, right? So Aristotle's acknowledging the role of nurture here, right? You need good parents who are involved. You need some type of structure. You need education. And you need a good education rather than just some of the crap that's out there. My God, some of the crazy ideas they teach in our schools. So they're refined, and that could mean they carry themselves well, they speak well, but it also acknowledges they've got wealth that provides these things. And they're active. That's a tricky one. I think probably what he means by active is active in public life. Remember what the function of the citizen is. The function of the citizen, their goal, their end, their telos, is to be involved in the life of their city. It's a small place. The polis has like 100,000 people in it. It's tiny. And the number of people who are citizens are even smaller than that, which means there's a lot of opportunity to be directly engaged and kind of make your success in that public life. So these people, they're refined because they're educated, and the very function of their education is to gear them for the political life, because this is what citizens do. In the same way that today we get all this education ultimately to be put out in the world. It's not the only reason, but it's the dominant one, to be put out in the world, to have a profession and to make money and to pay the bills and to, serve within the division of labor of society. These people, the main goal of education was to put them out into the political life so that they could participate and contribute to their community in terms of making laws and leading the people and so on and so forth. So they engage in politics. And up to this point, we've talked about the life of politics as something fairly noble, right? You're trying to do something for everybody. It has public benefit. You're trying to contribute to the common good, the common interest. But he has some funny things to say. You want to keep going, Cynthia?
Yes, sir. Okay, so I'm going to start again. The refined and active, on the other hand, choose honor, for this is pretty much the end of the political life.
Okay, so remember what he said about the goal of politics. The goal of politics in the book called the politics was the good of the community or the happiness of the polis. Agree or disagree?
Agree.
Yeah, all those laws, they were made with the idea, at least ideally, of benefiting the people.
Mhm.
Here he says something different. He says that people go into politics not to benefit their community, but for honor. Honor. Question: what is honor? What is honor all about?
Making your family proud.
I like that. Making your family proud.
Being available to make decisions, to be noticed, maybe.
Okay, to be noticed.
And
And of
respected.
course, how are you going to be noticed? You have to be doing important things to be really noticed. And the more
For the
important thing
people, for
you
the
do-
community, right?
Yes, right. So you're going to get, so to be honored, to get accolades, to get
Mhm.
even fame, to get recognition,
But
extreme.
based on the decisions you're making that benefits the people.
Yes.
Right?
So ideally, so there's a little problem with honor and honor recognition. I want my props. I want you to recognize my worth, my status, my superior status. We saw that this was a problem for Hobbes in what caused conflicts. He gave us like 3 different causes of conflicts between human beings that had to do with problems rooted in their nature. And one of them was the problem of estimation of one's worth. Everybody wants to be esteemed as superior to the other person. And if you think about that, obviously it can't work. And it would be like self-defeating if everyone tried to be esteemed more than the guy next to them, because esteem signifies that there's one person at the top and there's another person next, and you can't all win the Super Bowl. It just doesn't work that way. So there's a potential conflict between doing the right thing for your polis and wanting to be recognized. Of course, we see a lot of political figures today who want to be recognized, who we probably might agree in some cases are not necessarily doing the best thing. I mean, look at Trump. The whole criticism of Trump for 4 years was that he was desperate for attention. He had a deep psychological need to be recognized by as many people as possible. But then they said, but he didn't care about being president. He didn't care about the serious job of being president at all. Barack Obama said, I thought Trump might be a serious man in office, and I discovered he's just not serious at all. And one of the arguments was he just wants attention from people because
He's an attention junkie.
Yeah. And so what is Aristotle saying? He's saying, this is what politicians are really like.
Really?
They want attention. And part of this has to do, we'll wrap up in a second. Part of this has to do with the function of politics in ancient Greece. Politics wasn't just a stage to get honor, it was the stage. Today we've got Lady Gaga, we got professional sports, we got people who are famous because they're famous, like the Kardashians. We've got going viral on YouTube. We understand honor and recognition perfectly well. We just don't use this word honor anymore. We want to get attention. We want to get celebrity. That's a word we understand, but it's connected with honor. It also depends on what you get recognized for. There are things that are more and less honorable. But for the ancient Greeks, I mean, yes, they had athletics, they had artists, they had musicians, they had poets, they had tragic playwrights. All these people were also seeking recognition through what they did. But politics was the primary stage, really where you could achieve your highest kind of degree of honor. So let's see what Aristotle has to say about honor, and we'll call it a night.
Okay, so, but it appears to be more superficial than what is being sought. For honor seems to reside more with those who bestow bestowed it than with him who receives it. And we divine that the good is something of one's own and a thing not easily taken away. I wrote all my notes on top of this, that's why. Further, people seem to pursue honor so that they may be convinced that they themselves are good. At any rate, They seek to be honored by prudent, among those whom
By the prudent.
by the prudent, among those to whom they are known and for their virtue. It is clear then that in the case of these people, at least, virtue is superior.
Okay. So it turns out that the reason the political life is better than the life of pleasure, there's something wrong with the political life, but they pursue, the way they're going to get their honors is by achieving acts of moral virtue, right? Doing those good deeds for the public that's then going to get them recognition. What he seems to be saying here is that the real goal is not the acts of virtue, but the attention that they get from it. That's what's one of the problems. So he says something that's a little challenging, and just step through it here. He says, but it appears to be more superficial than what is being sought. What is the it and what is being sought? Well, the thing that's being sought in this conversation Aristotle is having with us is what happiness really is. That's what we're seeking. The it has to do with the political life. So let's translate. He says, but the political life appears to be more superficial than human happiness, because honor seems to reside more in those who bestow it than who receive it. Now, to bestow is to give, right? Honor seems to reside more in those who give it than those who receive it. Does the politician want to give or receive honor?
They want to receive.
Of course, they want to receive it. What do you think? That's why they go into politics, right? And what is he saying? The deed that seems more worthy of honor is the deed of giving honors rather than receiving honors. And the question is, why is it superior? And it seems to have something to do with the fact that happiness seems to be about doing things rather than getting things. And what the politician wants is to get something from someone else. And the secondary problem is that, well, what happens with politicians? One day they're all loved and revered, and the next day they're spit out and nobody cares about them, right? And you have very little control over that. So he says this. He says, for honor seems to reside more in those who give it than those who receive it. And he says, and we divine, we see through that the good is something of one's own and something not easily taken away, right? So the good is something you do. When he says the good, he's talking about happiness, right? He's talking about happiness. Happiness is something you do, something you achieve, something that somebody can't give you or take away from you. Honors, the problem with honors is honors are given and honors are taken away. So if your happiness is dependent on being honored by other people, well, one day they're there for you and the next day they're not, right? It's a capricious, it's fortuitous, right? Then he says something, and we'll leave with this remark because this is interesting. He says, for people seem to pursue honor, which is to say, people seem to pursue the life of politics so that they may be convinced that they themselves are good. Let me read it again. He says, people seem to pursue honor so that they may be convinced that they themselves are good. These people enter the life of politics because they need to convince themselves that they're good. If you need to convince yourself through recognition by other people that you're good, what does that say about you?
Low self-esteem.
It has everything to do with self-esteem. Absolutely. Think about recognition as a boost of one's self-esteem. Recognition is about recognizing someone else's worth, esteeming them, and esteem has to do with worth and recognition of it. If you have to be convinced by others that you're good, what does that say about you?
You don't love yourself. You're not happy with who you are.
Okay, very good. These people seem to be fundamentally unhappy with themselves. And as a way of coping with it, and we're actually going to see this again later on, as a way of coping with it, they seek out the high opinions of others. There is so much he says in this one sentence. It's amazing. And it doesn't seem like it. If they need to convince themselves that they're good, do you think they're good? What's your gut reaction?
No, they're really bad. They're trying to cover up something.
No, absolutely. And, talk about the ring of Gyges where you're good in public and you're naughty behind closed doors, right? These people, how do they get recognition from other people and make themselves feel good? They clearly engage in some type of hypocrisy where they do something naughty behind closed doors and then they come out to the people, the voters, and they tell the voters what they want to hear and they present themselves in the best image they can. And the voters give them adulation and recognition and respect, right? And if they need other people to convince them that they're good, it means that they themselves are not convinced of their own goodness, right?
Wait, so Professor, I have a really quick question. So with that being said, those people who go into politics, are they guilty because, like, when we go back to the definition of more virtue, I'm saying it correctly, is it because they haven't like done right to people or doing the act of doing right?
Yeah, so you got it almost to a T. He's actually going really deep into this issue, right? Superficially, he says that politics is the life of moral virtue. But here, what he really seems to be saying,
He's explaining everything, which is great.
So Cynthia hit it on the head. Cynthia hit it. There we go. Cynthia hit it on the head. She said these people don't seem to like themselves. They don't seem to love themselves. And we're going to see this later in book 9. And we're going to discover why these people don't like themselves.
You know what, Professor? I also have a friend of mine that I see that she seeks attention, but the attention that she seeks, instead of doing something positive to get positive attention, like she does the total opposite. Like she does really bad things, and people look at her and like wonder, like, really, like you want attention?
Okay.
It's weird.
When we get more clarity on what this person he's describing is like, we all know the people like this, right? That I know Aristotle says this in a way that's, it's like you're gritting your teeth, but
like not everybody seeks positive attention. Like there's people also that seek negative attention.
Well, these people are getting a kind of positive attention, but it's not saying something good about them. Why? Let's ask this. And we don't, all we have is this one sentence. So there's a lot that's not here. Why do these people not like themselves? Why do people not like themselves? I think there's a pretty simple reason as to why people, let's say they loathe themselves. They don't like that. They don't have a high opinion of themselves. They'd like to have a high opinion of themselves, but they don't. And let's take off the table, like, I don't know, someone who's got some kind of clinical issue or, some diagnosable depression or something like that. What about a normal person who doesn't like themselves? Why is that?
Because of the reactions from other people, maybe?
Could be. I mean, this is tricky because, well,
they're not being nurtured. Like maybe they didn't have family members or their environment.
Oh, definitely. We could get into a psychoanalysis of exactly what precipitated this condition. But I think he's going to have it. It's not all here. So I'm going to fill in a little bit. But, for him, in Aristotle's world, one of the primary causes of a lack of self-esteem or self-dislike is that we don't live up to the standards of right and wrong that we know we should live up to, right? So you're talking about things like shame or guilt, right? Which is, I know what the right thing is to do, because it's in many 99% of the time in life, what the right thing to do is pretty simple and pretty clear. And then there are very tricky times where it's not. But everybody kind of knows what the right thing to do is, but not everybody does it, right? And these people are feeling guilty because they have given in to their desires that, while they were satisfying in the moment, they know in the big picture are not the right thing to do. So therefore, they don't have a high opinion of themselves precisely because they've done the wrong thing. Even though they wanted to do the wrong thing, they also feel bad about having done the right thing. Because look at it here. They want to convince themselves that they are good. If they're trying to convince themselves they are good, they have some probably reason to believe that they're not so good. And I know we're speaking in general terms. We're not specifying like what the rules of morality here are exactly. But I mean, Aristotle has a basic acknowledgement that is true of most human beings, that obviously you want to have a high opinion of yourself. And one of the fundamental ways in which you achieve a high opinion is doing the things you know you should do. And when you do those things, you feel good about yourself. And so here, these people have done whatever it is, we don't know. They've done the wrong thing and they don't feel good about themselves. So what do? They try to escape themselves. They try to escape the low opinion they have of themselves because they know they haven't done the right thing. And they kind of, they console themselves and by shrouding themselves in the good opinions of other people. But here's the catch. How, if this person's not such a good person, how is it that, I don't know, the public has such a high opinion of them? This is a politician we're talking about, right?
They cover it up.
Exactly. They're hypocrites, right? I mean, this is what Aristotle's saying about politicians, right? And it's actually pretty critical. And I mean, this is what you see in real life in politics all the time, if you look closely enough, right? So they, of course, just like Gaijis, they don't show the public their bad behavior. They show them their best behavior. And it's even better if you have a fawning media that will craft your image to the public, and all the public sees is the coolest, hippest person that's ever been. And they never see all, I don't know, may not be deep, dark secrets, but they don't see your foibles and they don't see your flaws, and they don't see specifically the things you've done wrong because they're concealed, right? So what does this person do? Instead of trying to escape themselves by drinking or doing drugs or eating a lot of chocolate at 12 o'clock at night, they try to escape themselves by hiding, losing themselves in this high opinion that's been contrived by them presenting this appearance to people, where the people who respect them don't actually know the full picture of what they're really like. But we'll leave it with this. Recognition turns out to be really important. Aristotle's going to envision life as like a stage or a playing field in which we perform actions, and society is a big audience for our actions, like a stage, and they're judging us, right? So this raises an important question, this issue of honors, about how seriously or how important the judgments of other people are to our own behavior. And so he goes on to say, we want to be honored by the prudent. That's another name for the wise. And we want to be recognized by those who they're known, and we want to be recognized for our virtue, right? Should we care about the opinions of other people in terms of how we understand ourselves?
No.
I mean,
Okay, good.
sometimes the answer is no,
Okay,
but
good. So someone said no. So what's Aristotle's response to that? It depends on the people and what kind
that
of
was
people
what
they
I was
are.
going to say. Depends on the people.
Absolutely, right? Should there ideally, should there be a group who we base our own we see ourselves through their eyes, and that's a metaphor for we see ourselves through their judgments of us. Is that important in life, or should we all just be individuals and go and do our own thing?
Go and do our own thing.
It's tricky though.
All right. So what if, what if our children and our parents and our brothers and our sisters and our best friends all view us in a negative light simultaneously? Just hypothetically, imagine that situation. Your dog, your best friend, your kid, your parents, your brother, your sister, your friend, they all look at you in a negative way for
I see what
something
you're
you've done.
saying, yeah.
Should we be concerned with their opinion?
Obviously, yes, because it seems like
Yes.
everyone else
Okay,
is seeing
good.
that way.
So I would assume everybody would say obviously yes, but so it
Mhm.
illustrates. So Aristotle, I mean, for Aristotle, when he says we're the political and the social animal, he means that we are not distinct as human beings. Our identities are tethered to other people's opinions of us, right? We see ourselves to some degree through the eyes of others. And the real question is, do you have the right audience that you respect and that's going to give you good judgments about your identity? And obviously, if you have, he uses the word prudent, if you have wise people, if you have caring people, if you have morally virtuous people around you, and they're not looking at you in a positive light, it probably means you're doing something wrong, right? If your dog's looking at you in a mean way, it means you're doing something wrong, right? So obviously we could talk about those moments where we need courage to break out of the conforming to expectations of society, right? Where people try to box us in terms of our identity, where people try to put us in our place and tell us we can't do this or can't be that. Obviously, I think in those instances, we would say we need the courage to rise up and confront and ignore those opinions and even the consequences. There may be some negative consequences for being one's own person, right? But Aristotle wants to acknowledge that you ideally you have a core audience who you need to use as a point of reference in understanding who you are. What would you call those people? Those people that you could trust in viewing yourself through their eyes.
Friends?
Yes. Let's put it that way. They're going to be you would call them friends, and you would call them essential to your life, right? So let's finish with this. We want to be happy. We want to be virtuous. That's what Aristotle's telling us. But being virtuous is not easy. Guess what? We can't do it alone. We need friends. And among other things, what friends are going to do is to make judgments on us, right? They're going to be honest with us when we don't want to hear the honesty. And just to flip it around, they're not going to flatter us and lie to us when and just tell us what we want to hear. Let's go back to this politician. This politician is surrounding themselves with people who are flatterers. People who are flatterers just tell you what you want to hear. And of course, what you want to hear doesn't benefit you. It feels good in the moment. And then the question is, why does the flatterer tell you what you want to hear? Why does the flatterer just tell you what you want to hear?
So you can also like them.
Yeah, and what's their MO? What's their real reason for flattering you?
To get what they want.
Yes, they don't really believe what they're saying when they esteem you and give you honors. They're just saying it because that's the bargain. They're trying to get what they're not interested in you. They don't really respect you in the way they claim. They're just trying to get what they need. And it's not really about you, are just a means to their end. And while it looks like they're honoring you, they're actually using you. Right. So it's pretty, all this stuff is lurking here in this paragraph, and it unfolds in books 8 and 9, particularly book 9, which gets in the weeds of things. Okay, so we should comments, questions, observations. We've been here a long time. We need to call it a night.
All I have to say, I think this is very interesting, especially when you explain it.
Yes.
I think we could all learn from it, especially what he thinks what a friend is. And I think that if all of us actually surround ourselves with people like that, the society that we live in now would not be the same.
Oh yeah, I mean, so you know what the argument you just made is a version of the argument we're going to see in Rousseau, where he talks about the development of society and everything goes wrong. And actually that's the world he's living in. The world that went wrong is actually the world he's living in. He's describing it. And the problem of that world for him is that everybody is seeking recognition and they're all doing it for the wrong, to put it in a nutshell, they're all doing it for the wrong reasons. And instead of it contributing to their happiness, it's actually contributing to their unhappiness. And he gets in questions of kind of like the rat race, of people feeling oppressively obliged to meet the expectations of society in a way that it doesn't actually conform with who they actually are and what their real needs, both as individual human beings, but in general, what a human being needs to be happy. He's got some very important differences with Aristotle, but he has some interesting common ground. Okay, yeah. So I think the thing with this text is once you start to unpack it and you see what he's talking about and you penetrate this really remote way of speaking, you realize he's speaking about flesh and blood situations that many of which you're very familiar with, and you can start to draw examples on from your own life, or at least variations of it. But it takes some time to kind of wade through what he's saying, and also honestly, to grasp this text, like you really have to see it in its totality, and that takes some time. Okay, so for the break, you'll read 8 and 9, and we'll probably come back to this stuff after the break, and I will post specifically. I have to post the next assignment, but it was a really lovely discussion, and thank you guys for hanging in there so long. I appreciate that, because it takes some time to kind of get into the weeds here and start seeing what's going on, but I'm glad people found it interesting. And yes, if you have like personal reflections that tie in, that are appropriate for class, by all means, because I think once you give examples of what Aristotle's describing, it becomes more clear to people what he's actually talking about. Oh.
Professor, I just have a quick question. So, are you gonna post this recording? Because I think this is really gonna help.
Yes. So, I mean, I've been putting them all up. So I've been doing the recordings for a few weeks now. So I'll put it in. I'll put it in the current week's folder, but I also put it in next week's folder as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for a lovely evening. I think you've all learned a break. So have a great spring break. Be safe. Have fun. Pursue your happiness.
Thank you, Professor.
Same to you.
Thank you, Professor. You
Good night.
too.
You too. Good night.
Good night.
Professor, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, I have to show you the book.
Oh,
can you see me? Oh no, it's super dark, but look.
It's a little dark. Let me just. Okay.
So.
And you got the other ones?
Yes.
Great. Perfect.
On this side.
Perfect. Thumbs up. Got it. All right. So we're good, Joel.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right. Have a good night.